I'm 73 years old and I've kept a secret for 27 years that I finally need to share, not because I'm dying, though I am, but because I've spent nearly 3 decades trying to forget something I learned, and I need someone else to know why I tried so hard to fail. His name was Samuel Carthage. He kept a lighthouse on an offshore station in the North Atlantic for 21 years. For 19 of those years, he had friends who weren't human. And in the 20th year, they told him something about the ocean that broke him in a way that had nothing to do with madness. He didn't lose his mind. He lost something worse, the ability to look at the sea the way he had before. He knew what it actually was. This is what the records show, what the journals reveal, and what one conversation at the very end of his life confirmed. This is about a man who loved the ocean until he understood it and spent his remaining years trying to feel wonder instead of mechanism. The offshore lighthouse stations of the early 20th century North Atlantic represented the extreme edge of human habitation. These weren't the picturesque coastal towers with keepers' cottages and vegetable gardens. These were engineering fortresses bolted to rocks miles from land, where waves broke over the gallery during storms, and the nearest human voice was an 8-week resupply boat away. The men who sought these positions were a specific type, not broken exactly, but requiring something most people feared. The U.S. Lighthouse Service kept psychological assessments starting in 1903, trying to predict who would last and who would request emergency evacuation after 3 weeks. The successful candidates shared patterns: preference for written over verbal communication, comfort with repetitive tasks, low baseline need for novelty, and what one examiner called an unusual relationship with time. They don't seem to feel it passing the way others do. Samuel Carthage fit every marker. He applied for offshore duty in 1897 at age 36, after 7 years as assistant keeper at a mainland station. His record noted exceptional reliability, minimal social integration with town, requests additional shifts. He wasn't fleeing anything documented, no scandal, no grief, no breakdown. He simply seemed to experience other people as noise and solitude as clarity. The station they gave him was designated Atlantic Rock Station 7, though keepers called it the Tooth. It rose 60 feet from a granite spike 8 miles off the Nova Scotia coast, accessible only during calm seas. The tower itself was 40 feet of stone, with an iron lantern room, a watch room, a supply room, and a keeper's quarters that measured 12 by 14 feet. One window, one door, one purpose. The Lighthouse Service expected keepers to maintain detailed logs: weather, visibility, passing vessels, equipment condition, and a daily summary. Carthage's logs from the first year reveal the standard adjustment pattern. Week 1, detailed observations, careful prose, awareness of the reader. Week 4, abbreviated notes, task focus. Week 8, a shift into something else. Entries that weren't reports but conversations with himself, working through thoughts on paper because there was no other way to hear them completed. March 15th, 1898. Wind northeast, 15 knots, visibility 8 miles, 3 schooners southbound, scrubbed lantern glass, inventoried lamp oil. The silence here isn't absence of sound. There's always wind, always water. It's absence of interruption. A sentence in my head can finish. This wasn't deterioration. This was adaptation. Isolation produces predictable psychological changes in stable personalities. The internal monologue externalizes. Time sense detaches from clock-based structure and attaches to natural cycles, tides, daylight, weather patterns. The boundary between self and environment becomes permeable in a way that would seem pathological in normal social contexts, but represents functional adjustment in extreme solitude. By his second year, Carthage had stopped writing for an imagined reader. His logs became thinking spaces, observations that accumulated into patterns only he would track. January 7th, 1899. Storm 3 days. Waves breaking over gallery, phosphorescence in the water at night, green light in every swell. It looks like breathing. Ridiculous thought, but it does. The Lighthouse service rotations called for 8 weeks on station, 2 weeks shore leave. Carthage began declining leave, starting his 3rd year. The records show him taking only 4 days off in 1899, 2 in 1900, none in 1901. This triggered a service review. Extended isolation was considered a warning sign. But the inspector's report noted facility in exceptional condition, keeper mentally stable, physically healthy, explicitly requesting extended duty, recommend approval. What the inspector didn't note, because it wasn't in his mandate, was what Carthage had begun doing with his solitude. The practical routines that filled Lighthouse days, trimming wicks, winding clockworks, scrubbing salt, inventorying supplies, these had become something else, not quite ritual, not yet, but approaching it. He began disposing of kitchen scraps at the same tidal pool on the rocks below the tower. Not because it was closest, it wasn't, but because the pool refilled completely twice daily, natural removal. He started this in year 2, practical reasoning. But by year 3 he was timing it to the tide, arriving at the pool within the same 10-minute window each day, setting the scraps on the same rock. August 22nd, 1900. Gull takes the bread before it touches stone now, waits on the ridge, knows the schedule better than I do. Speaking aloud became standard. The human voice requires maintenance in isolation. Documented cases show keepers who stopped speaking completely found themselves physically unable to produce speech normally after months of silence. Carthage talked to himself during tasks, narrating repairs, arguing through problems, reading his logs aloud to catch errors. But somewhere in year 4, the narration shifted audience. He wasn't talking to himself anymore. He was talking to the station, to the ocean, to the act of speaking itself. November 3rd, 1901. Told the east wall it needs repointing. It didn't argue. This is what counts as conversation now. The psychology of this is well documented in isolation research. The human brain seeks interaction with such fundamental force that in the absence of other humans, it will construct interaction from available materials. Antarctic researchers reported conversations with equipment. Solo sailors named their boats and argued with them. Hermits spoke to trees, rocks, weather. This wasn't pathology. This was the brain maintaining social capacity in an environment that provided no social outlet. Carthage lasted because he never fought the transformation. He didn't try to preserve his mainland self in offshore circumstances. He became the person the environment required, someone who could find companionship in pattern, conversation in observation, and meaning in repetition. By year 5, he had constructed a life that worked. The lighthouse became not a prison, but a position, the specific place where he fit. The isolation became not endurance, but preference. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that his rituals had been noticed, that his patterns had made him predictable, and that something in the water had been watching long enough to distinguish intention from accident. The ocean had decided he might be ready for contact. The transformation from routine to ritual happens in degrees small enough that the person performing them doesn't notice the crossing point. Carthage's shift began with the tidal pool. By his 5th year, 1902, the practical justification for using that specific pool had dissolved. He'd worn a path across the rocks to reach it, 30 yards from the tower entrance, when there were disposal points 10 yards closer. He arrived at the same time twice daily, regardless of weather. He placed the scraps on the same flat stone, though the pool had a dozen surfaces that would work as well. April 14, 1902. Seal in the pool today. Large male, scarred face, didn't spook when I approached. Took a fish head directly from the rock while I watched. Yellow eyes, strange intelligence in them, felt almost like it was waiting for me. This was the first mention of the seal. It wouldn't be the last. Marine mammals demonstrate site fidelity, the tendency to return to specific locations across years or even decades. Gray seals and harbor seals particularly show this behavior, establishing haul-out sites they visit with seasonal regularity. Certain individuals become recognizable to human observers through scarring, coloration, or behavioral quirks. But site fidelity explains presence, not timing. The seal began appearing during Carthage's feeding window, the 20-minute period twice daily when he brought scraps. Not nearby, not eventually, during. May 1st, 1902. Seal again, third day in a row, afternoon tide. It's waiting on the east ledge now, watching the tower. When I come down, it slides into the pool, takes whatever I leave, doesn't eat immediately, holds fish in mouth, watches me, then swallows. Behavior feels considered, deliberate. Carthage wasn't anthropomorphizing carelessly. His logs distinguish between observation and interpretation, marking his own uncertainty, but something in the seal's behavior resisted animal explanation. The watching, the waiting, the pattern. June 10th, 1902. Seal every day now. Both tides when possible. Depends on haul-out schedule, I think. Brought extra mackerel today. It took 3 pieces. Didn't leave between them. Just waited for each one. I stayed longer than usual. It stayed too. We watched each other. 5 minutes, 10. Time moved strangely. Eventually I left. It remained. The human brain is wired to detect agency, the presence of intention behind action. This trait evolved as survival mechanism. Better to mistake wind for predator than predator for wind. Isolated individuals, deprived of social agency, become hypervigilant for it in other sources. But Carthage's logs don't read as pareidolia, the false perception of significance. They read as careful documentation of pattern recognition, cross-checked against his own skepticism. July 2nd, 1902. Experimenting. Came to pool 1 hour late today. Seal wasn't there. Arrived next, feeding on schedule. Seal present. Tomorrow we'll try arriving early. July 3rd, 1902. Arrived 30 minutes before usual time. No seal. Waited. It appeared within 5 minutes of the usual window. Not when I arrived, when I usually arrive. This suggested the seal was tracking time independent of Carthage's presence. Circadian rhythms can explain general daily patterns in animals, but not precision to specific windows measured in minutes. August 20th, 1902. Spoke to it today. Felt absurd, but I talked to everything else here, said good afternoon, it cocked its head, definitely responded to voice. Stayed 20 minutes. I narrated what I was doing, bringing you mackerel today, 3 pieces, caught this morning. It watched my mouth, not my hands, my mouth. Seals have exceptional hearing, particularly in the frequency range of human speech. They're capable of vocal learning, the ability to modify their vocalizations based on what they hear. Research wouldn't confirm this capacity until much later, but Carthage was documenting its evidence. September 15th, 1902. It's not just one seal, there's a second, smaller, lighter coloring, no facial scarring, appeared 3 days ago. The first seal, I've started thinking of it as the old one, seemed to introduce the new one. They arrived together. Old one entered pool first, took food, then backed away. New one approached cautiously. I offered fish. It took it. Old one watched the entire interaction. This felt like teaching. The establishment of regular contact with 2 individuals shifted something in Carthage's documentation. He began noting details beyond feeding, vocalizations, interactions between the seals, behavioral quirks. October 8th, 1902. The younger one makes a sound, clicks, but patterned. 3 short, 1 long, repeated. Does this before feeding? Old one doesn't make the same sound. Individual signature? I tried clicking back, Both seals went motionless, watched me. I repeated the pattern. Young one responded with same pattern, then different pattern, too long, too short. Conversational structure? Marine mammals use signature vocalizations. Dolphins have signature whistles that function as names. Seals produce distinct calls for identity and contact. Carthage was observing this without the research framework to explain it, so he documented it as questions. His logs from late 1902 show him developing response patterns, specific clicks for specific seals, different tones when offering food versus greeting, deliberate repetition to test for learned recognition. November 30th, 1902. Undeniable now. They know my sounds, respond differently to different patterns. When I use the 3 short, 1 long, the young one approaches. When I use 2 long, 2 short, both of them orient toward me but don't approach. Context matters. Meaning is present. This was the threshold, the moment Carthage stopped interpreting the interactions as animal behavior and started treating them as communication. December 25th, 1902. Christmas. Strange to market here. Brought the seals double portions, stayed longer than usual, tried something new, tapped rhythm on the rock with a stone. Simple pattern, 4 beats. Old one watched. I repeated it. Old one slapped flipper against water. 4 times, exact rhythm. I sat down, felt like something important had happened, like a door opened. Ritual requires repetition, significance, and transformation of ordinary action into meaningful performance. Carthage's feedings had become all 3. He wasn't disposing of scraps anymore. He was keeping appointments, building relationship, participating in exchange that both parties recognized as mattering. The practical origin was gone. What remained was connection. January 15th, 1903. They don't always eat what I bring now. Sometimes they take it and drop it back in the water. Not rejection. They stay, watch me wait. I think they're coming for the interaction itself, not the food, the contact. Carthage had constructed a ritual that gave structure to his isolation, and the seals had joined it. For 2 years this continued. Regular meetings, evolving communication, mutual adjustment. He didn't name them. His logs never used names, only the old one and the young one. Perhaps because naming would make explicit what he was trying not to acknowledge, that these weren't animals visiting his station. They were companions. March 7th, 1904. 2 years now since the old one first appeared. I've kept no other commitment this long except the light itself. Strange to realize these seals are the longest relationship I've maintained with any living thing. Stranger still that it doesn't feel strange. The ritual was complete. The pattern was established. Neither party broke it. But in year 7, the seals broke something else. They broke his assumption about what they were. And once that assumption shattered, there was no way to repair it. The first anomaly appeared in September of his 3rd year. A gray seal, distinctive for the pale scarring across its left shoulder, began arriving at the eastern tidal pool every 4th morning, precisely at dawn. The keeper noticed because he'd begun cataloging the wildlife, not scientifically, but as a way to structure his observations, to have something to write in the log besides lamp oil levels and fog durations. He called her Scar. Not out loud at first, just in his records. She came on a rhythm that didn't match feeding patterns. The pool held no particular abundance of fish. She didn't hunt when she arrived. She surfaced, remained visible for 10 to 15 minutes, then departed. The keeper documented this for 6 weeks before he allowed himself to notice what he was noticing. She was waiting. For what? He couldn't say. But the behavior had intention behind it. By November, there were 3 regulars. Scar still came every 4th dawn. A larger bull seal appeared on the 6th night after each new moon, always at the northwest rocks where the keeper dumped fish scraps from his meals. A harbor seal he called Torn Fin visited irregularly but always during the same tidal window, mid-ebb, when specific rocks emerged. He knew seal intelligence. They were clever animals, capable of learning human schedules, associating locations with food. Marine biologists had documented seals returning to fishing boats, recognizing individual fishermen, even responding to names. What he was seeing fit comfortably within known behavior, except for the watching. Seals were wary creatures. They observed from distance, fled at sudden movement. These three did watch from the expected range, but their attention felt different. The keeper had spent enough time alone to trust his instincts about being observed. These animals weren't monitoring for threat. They were studying. He tested it in December. For 1 week, he changed nothing in his routine except his position during Scar's dawn visits. Instead of staying inside the lighthouse, he stood on the eastern rocks, clearly visible. Scar surfaced at her usual spot, 40 feet offshore. She didn't flee. She stayed the full 15 minutes, her gaze steady on him. The second week, he brought a lantern, held it up when she surfaced. She dove immediately, but returned 3 minutes later, surfaced closer, perhaps 30 feet out. Watched the light. The third week, he brought fish scraps, tossed one into the pool. She didn't approach it. She watched him throw it, watched where it landed, then submerged and was gone. This is where most people would have stopped. The seal was clearly disturbed by the change. The scientific response would be to resume normal patterns and let the animal return to comfortable behavior. The keeper waited 3 days, then went back to the rocks with fish. Tossed at the same distance, same time, same movements. Scar came, watched, left. He did this for 2 weeks. Consistent offering, consistent time, no variation except his presence. On the 15th morning, Scar took the fish. She didn't snatch and flee. She approached slowly, took it with what looked like care, surfaced 10 feet away, and consumed it while maintaining eye contact with the keeper. Then she vocalized, a sound he'd never heard from her before. Not distress, not mating call, a single measured tone that carried across the water with unmistakable deliberateness. The keeper stood motionless. Scar repeated it. Same pitch, same duration. Then dove and vanished. He didn't record this in the official log. He started a separate journal that night, kept in his personal quarters. The first entry read, "I think she's trying to talk." By the end of that winter, the pattern was undeniable. The 3 seals had stopped behaving like wildlife and started behaving like participants. They adjusted their timing based on his presence. When he was delayed by maintenance work, they waited longer than their normal duration. When he moved to different vantage points, they shifted position to maintain sightlines. They vocalized specific sounds that recurred in specific contexts, sounds that didn't appear in any reference material he had on Atlantic seal communication. The keeper was not a scientist, but he'd read extensively during the long winters. He knew about dolphin signature whistles, individualized calls that function as names. He knew about whale songs, about orca cultural transmission, about the documented cases of cetaceans engaging in what researchers carefully called directed communication attempts with humans. What he was seeing fit those patterns, except these weren't dolphins or whales. They were seals, species not known for that level of communicative sophistication. And the watching had intensified. In March, during an unusual warm spell, all 3 arrived simultaneously. This had never happened. Each kept to their established territories. Scar in the eastern pool, Bull at the northwest rocks, Torn Fin at the mid-ebb emergence, but they'd synchronized their visit to overlap perfectly during a 90-minute window. The keeper stood at the lighthouse gallery, looking down at the 3 distinct locations where each seal surfaced, held position, and watched. Not the lighthouse. Him, he tested it. Moved inside where he couldn't be seen. Within 5 minutes, all 3 were gone. Returned to the gallery. Within 10 minutes, all 3 resurfaced. That night he wrote, "They're not habituated to the location. They're tracking me specifically." April brought the first object. He found it on the eastern rocks after Scar's dawn visit. A piece of sea glass, worn smooth, placed on the flat stone where he always stood. Not washed up, the tide had been ebbing, and the glass sat above the waterline, centered on the rock with the kind of placement that didn't happen naturally. The keeper picked it up, turned it in the early light. Ordinary green glass, probably from a bottle, decades of wave action rounding every edge. He looked out at the water where Scar had been. The pool was empty, but he had the sudden, overwhelming certainty that she'd left this, intentionally, for him. He kept the glass, added it to his journal entry with a question he didn't want to answer. Gift? Payment? Communication? 3 days later, after Bull's visit, there was a crab shell on the northwest rocks, intact, cleaned, positioned on the exact stone where the keeper usually placed fish scraps. After Torn Finn's next visit, a small piece of driftwood, worn into a shape that almost resembled a curved hand. The keeper stopped writing questions in his journal. He knew what this was. He'd read accounts of corvids bringing gifts to humans who fed them, of octopuses presenting shells to aquarium keepers they recognized, of the documented cases of wild orcas in Puget Sound bringing salmon to specific researchers. This was reciprocity. This was relationship. That May, he started bringing his own objects, nothing elaborate, interesting stones he found on the rocks, pieces of metal worn smooth by salt water, once a small hand mirror that caught the light. He'd place them at the locations where each seal surfaced, always before their expected arrival. The objects were always gone by the next visit, and new ones appeared in their place. By summer, the exchange had its own vocabulary. Smooth objects meant calm seas ahead. He tested this correlation over weeks and found it held with uncomfortable accuracy. Rough or jagged objects appeared before storms. Once, Scar left a piece of black volcanic glass on the morning before a fog so dense the keeper couldn't see the rocks below his lighthouse. The glass was cold to the touch, despite sitting in sunlight, as if warning of the temperature drop. He stopped questioning whether he was projecting meaning onto randomness. The patterns were too consistent, too responsive to his own actions. In August, the communication shifted. The keeper had been tapping out rhythms on the rocks, unconsciously at first, then deliberately, when he noticed Scar responding. He'd tap a simple pattern, 3 beats, pause, 2 beats. Scar began repeating it back to him, slapping the water with her flipper in the exact rhythm. He tried variations. She matched them. He tried introducing new patterns. She'd repeat them once, then offer her own, which he'd repeat back. By September, they had a system. Not language, but exchange. Call and response that carried meaning in its structure, if not its content. The night he realized what had happened, that he was genuinely communicating with something non-human, the keeper sat in his quarters with a profound unease he couldn't name. This should have felt like wonder, like a naturalist's dream. Instead, it felt like approaching something that had been waiting for him to notice it, waiting for years. With patience that suggested it operated on time frames he couldn't comprehend. In his journal that night, "They were here before I started leaving food, before I started any routine. I didn't train them to come. They chose to make contact, which means they've been watching longer than I've been watching them, which means they were waiting for me to be ready. The question I can't escape, ready for what?" By his 4th winter, the keeper had stopped using the word seal in his private notes. He didn't know what they were, but he knew what they weren't, and he knew, with the certainty of a man who'd lived alone long enough to trust his instincts, that they were about to show him. It happened during the February new moon, on a night cold enough that spray froze on the rocks before the next wave arrived. The keeper had been tracking the lunar patterns in his private journal, not for navigation, but because he'd noticed all 3 of his regular visitors adjusted their timing around moon phases, not in the predictable ways tied to tides, but in deliberate synchronization with the dark moon specifically. Their visits clustered in the 3 nights before new moon, then paused completely for the week following. He'd documented this for 8 cycles without understanding it. The 9th cycle, he decided to wait outside during the new moon itself. No practical reason. The light was automated. The lens rotation mechanism checked and confirmed. He had no duties that required him on the rocks at midnight in February. But the pattern had been too consistent, and the keeper had spent 4 years learning to recognize when his presence was being requested. He dressed in his heaviest weather gear and positioned himself on the eastern rocks at 11:30, giving himself time to settle before midnight. The ocean was calmer than it had any right to be in February, not glass smooth but eerily organized, waves arriving in steady sets with none of the chaotic cross-chop typical of winter seas. The lighthouse beam swept overhead every 30 seconds, the only light source in absolute darkness. No moon, no stars behind the cloud cover, just the rotating pulse of illumination that briefly revealed the rocks before abandoning them to black. The keeper waited. Midnight came. The temperature continued dropping. His breath froze in his beard. At 12:17 by his pocket watch, the water in the eastern pool moved wrong. Not a wave, not wind chop. A displacement from below, deliberate and controlled, creating a swell that rose smoothly and subsided without turbulence. In the next sweep of the lighthouse beam, he saw her. Not Scar, not a seal. The face that surfaced 15 feet from the rocks was humanoid in the way that filled him with immediate vertigo, close enough to human features that his mind screamed recognition, different enough that recognition felt like violation of natural law. Large eyes positioned slightly too far apart, no visible nose, just a smooth slope from brow to a mouth that seemed too wide when closed. Skin that appeared gray-green in the lighthouse beam, textured in a way he couldn't process in the brief seconds of light. She watched him. The keeper's first instinct was to run. His second, which arrived before he'd moved a muscle, was that running would end this. And whatever this was had taken 4 years to build toward. He stayed motionless. The beam rotated away, plunging them both into darkness. He heard her breathing, or something like breathing, a measured draw and release of air that sounded almost mechanical in its precision. When the light returned, she'd moved closer, 10 feet from the rocks now, still watching. Her expression, if expression was the right word for the arrangement of features he was seeing, held no threat. It read as assessment, curiosity, and something that looked uncomfortably like concern. The keeper's own breathing had gone shallow. He forced it slower, deeper, trying to signal calm he didn't feel. In the next rotation of darkness, he heard a second surfacing, then a third. When light returned, all 3 were visible. The one he'd mentally designated as Scar was in her usual position but revealed now in her actual form, smaller than the first, with scarring across her shoulder that was clearly old damage, maybe from a boat propeller. The second was larger, powerfully built through the shoulders and chest. The third was lean, with a torn dorsal ridge that explained the damaged fin he'd seen in seal form. Seal form. The keeper's mind caught on that phrase. Seal form implied these creatures had multiple forms, which implied shape-shifting, which implied he'd lost his mind in isolation and was currently hypothermic and hallucinating. Except the cold was too specific, the details too consistent, and nothing in 4 years of solitude had produced visions before. The largest one, Bull, his mind supplied helplessly, raised one arm from the water, not a flipper. An arm that ended in a hand with too many fingers, webbing visible between each digit. She, he was suddenly certain it was she, made a gesture. Raised hand, palm forward, held for 3 seconds, then lowered it and repeated the motion. The keeper recognized it from months of their exchange. This was the pattern she'd used when leaving objects, the gesture that preceded gift-giving. His hand moved before he'd decided to move it. Raised, palm forward, held, lowered, repeating her motion. All three went motionless. Then the first one, the one who'd been Scar, lifted both hands from the water and tapped them together in a rhythm the keeper knew intimately. 3 beats, pause, 2 beats. The pattern he'd been tapping on rocks for months. His heart hammered against his ribs. His hands were shaking, though whether from cold or fear or something else entirely, he couldn't identify. He brought his gloved hands together and repeated the rhythm. 3 beats, pause, 2 beats. The reaction was immediate. All three began vocalizing, not the seal sounds he'd recorded, but something between song and speech, layered harmonics that seemed to resonate in his chest. The sound held no aggression. It read as excitement, recognition, relief. The beam swept past. In darkness, the vocalizations continued, growing more complex. He heard pattern in it, repetition, variation, communication flowing between the three of them in rapid exchange. When light returned, they'd arranged themselves in a semicircle, equidistant from where he stood, perfectly positioned so he could see all three in the same sweep of the beam. This was intentional. This was presentation. The smallest one, Scar, submerged briefly, then resurfaced with an object held in both hands. She moved to the edge of the rocks, as close as she could approach without beaching herself, and placed it on the stone. The keeper waited for darkness, then moved forward, and picked it up. It was heavy, metallic, encrusted with growth, but clearly manufactured. When the light came around again, he saw it clearly. A ship's chronometer, brass casing corroded, but the glass face intact, stopped permanently at 3:47. He looked up. All three were watching. He understood. This wasn't random salvage. This was proof. Evidence that they operated below human sight, that they moved through shipwrecks and debris fields, that they'd been present for disasters and sinkings and the quiet accumulation of human objects on the ocean floor. This was them showing him they knew what he was, what humanity was, that they'd been watching far longer than 4 years. The keeper set the chronometer down carefully and met the gaze of the first one, the largest, the one who'd surfaced initially. She held his stare for a full rotation of the lighthouse beam. Then she opened her mouth and spoke. Not words, not any language he knew, but sound shaped deliberately, pushed through a vocal structure not designed for human speech, but attempting it anyway. 3 syllables that rose and fell with tonal precision. She repeated it. Same sounds, same tones, watching him with absolute focus. He tried to repeat it back. His pronunciation was terrible, the sounds wrong, coming from his throat, but he matched the rhythm and attempted the tonal pattern. All three responded instantly with a harmonic vocalization again. Encouragement, he realized. Positive reinforcement. She spoke the 3 syllables again, slower this time. He repeated them, closer this time to her original sounds. She raised her hand from the water and placed it against her own chest, over where her heart would be if her anatomy matched human structure. Then she repeated the 3 syllables and waited. The keeper's understanding arrived like cold water. This was a name, her name. She was introducing herself. His voice was hoarse from cold and fear when he spoke. Thomas. He placed his gloved hand against his own chest. Thomas Wicklow. She repeated it immediately. Tomas. Not perfect, but unmistakable, his name in her voice. Then she gestured to the other 2 in sequence, speaking different syllable combinations for each. Names. They all had names. The keeper repeated each one as carefully as he could, knowing he was mangling the pronunciation, but trying. When he'd attempted all 3, they responded with the harmonic sound again, and something in his chest unlocked. This was first contact. This was the moment every naturalist dreamed of, and no scientist had documented. Communication with intelligence utterly unlike human consciousness, beings that had been categorized as myth for millennia, and they'd chosen him, not because he was qualified or credentialed, but because he'd been alone long enough to pay attention, patient enough to wait, and present enough to see them when they decided to be seen. The largest one dove briefly, resurfaced, and placed something else on the rocks. When the beam came around, the keeper saw it was fresh fish, still alive, gasping. She vocalized a simple two-tone pattern, then gestured to the fish, then to him. Offering, gift, food. He picked up the fish, held it up so she could see he'd received it, then spoke. Thank you. She repeated the syllables. Thank you. Testing them, learning. They stayed for another hour, visible only in 30-second intervals, when the beam swept past, communicating in the limited vocabulary of gesture and tone they were constructing together. The keeper learned their signs for yes, no, wait, danger, safe. They learned his. Neither side could express complex ideas yet, but the framework was established. When they finally submerged for the last time that night, sinking below the black water in perfect synchronization, the keeper stood alone on the rocks with a ship's chronometer and a dying fish, and the certain knowledge that everything he thought he understood about isolation had just been rewritten. He didn't go inside for another hour. He stood in the cold, watching the empty water, waiting to see if they'd return. They didn't. But in the morning, there were 3 objects on the rocks where they'd surfaced. Smooth stones worn by millennia of waves, placed in a triangle pattern that couldn't be natural. The keeper picked them up one by one. In his journal that day, he wrote only, "They're real. They've been real this whole time, and they've been waiting for me to be ready to see them." The terror didn't hit him until 3 days later. Not terror of what they were, terror of what it meant that they existed, that the ocean contained intelligence he'd never suspected, that he'd spent 4 years living above communities he couldn't see, that every wave and tide and migration pattern might contain intention he'd been too limited to recognize. Terror of how much he didn't know about the water he'd served his entire adult life. And underneath that, a growing certainty that they'd revealed themselves because they had decided he could be trusted, which meant they needed something, which meant this wasn't just contact, this was recruitment. The 3rd year was when it stopped being observation and became something else. He'd documented the pattern by then. 2 individuals, distinguishable by size and the specific configuration of markings he could see when they surfaced near the rocks. They came on the spring tides, always at dusk, always to the same tidal pool on the northeast face where the shelf drops into deep water. They stayed between 20 minutes and 2 hours. They watched him, and he'd begun watching back. Not with the clinical distance he'd maintained initially, not with the fear that had characterized those first encounters. He watched them the way you watch a neighbor whose routines have synchronized with your own, noting absences, registering returns, developing the specific attention that only repeated exposure creates. The offerings had become regular, not worship, not appeasement. Closer to the way you leave food for a stray cat, except the stray cat is intelligent in ways you're only beginning to recognize, and the food is a pretense for the actual exchange, which is presence. He brought fish scraps, kelp he'd harvested from the accessible rocks, once a piece of driftwood carved into something that might have been decorative. They took some items, ignored others. The pattern of acceptance seemed arbitrary until he realized it wasn't. They took things that came from the water. They ignored things that came from land. The driftwood, ocean-smoothed for decades, they examined for nearly an hour before taking it under. The first gesture he understood clearly came in October of the 4th year. He'd climbed down to the tidal pool at the usual time, carrying nothing. A maintenance shipment had been delayed. He was rationing supplies and had nothing to spare. He sat on the rocks anyway, having discovered that his presence mattered independent of offerings. They surfaced 20 minutes after sunset. The larger one, the one he'd started thinking of as the scout, though he had no evidence for the role, floated 15 feet offshore, watching, waiting. He spread his hands, showing them empty. A human gesture, probably meaningless to them, but he'd learned that any consistent signal eventually acquired meaning through repetition. The scout dove. Returned 3 minutes later with a fish in its mouth, something silver, still struggling. Surfaced closer to the rocks than usual, close enough that he could see the bioluminescence tracing patterns in the water around its body. It opened its mouth. The fish dropped onto the rock shelf between them. He stared at it, at the scout, at the second one, which had surfaced beside the first and was making a low sound he'd learned to associate with attention. He reached forward slowly, picked up the fish. It was fresh, still alive, specific to these waters. Something he would have caught himself if he'd had time to fish that day. "Thank you," he said. The words were reflex, absurd, spoken to creatures that didn't process language the way humans did. But the tone carried. He'd learned that much. Tone and gesture formed the grammar they were building together. The scout dipped its head, a motion he'd seen before, usually after he left offerings. Then both of them were gone, sliding under the surface with barely a ripple. He cleaned the fish, cooked it, ate it, while watching the place where they'd disappeared. That was the night he understood it had become friendship. By the 5th year they were teaching him their patterns, not language. He never believed he understood their language, if they had one, in the way humans meant the term. But they had signals, rhythms, types of movement and sound that carried consistent meaning across repetitions. A sharp, clicking vocalization meant caution. He heard it once before. A storm arrived 6 hours later, and again the night a Portuguese man, a warbloom, drifted into the shallows. A slow spiral dive followed by surfacing in the same spot meant an invitation. He learned to watch when they did this, to follow their gaze or the angle of their bodies, and discovered they were showing him things. A pod of pilot whales passing in deep water, a school of tuna dense enough to darken the ocean surface, once a whale shark that moved through the dark like a bus-sized ghost. A specific posture, vertical in the water, heads above the surface, utterly still, meant they were listening. He learned to stop moving when he saw this. Something was happening beyond his perception, and they were paying attention with senses he didn't possess. He started teaching them his patterns in return. 3 taps on stone meant he was coming down to the pool. He'd started doing it unconsciously, knocking his walking stick against the rocks as he descended the path. By the 6th year, they began surfacing within minutes of the sound, even when he arrived outside their usual schedule. A specific whistle, something he could produce loudly enough to carry over wind, meant danger. He used it once when a maintenance vessel approached earlier than scheduled, giving them time to retreat to deep water before the crew arrived. He never saw them that day, but the next evening they both surfaced at once, and the scout brought him something that might have been a gift, a piece of worn glass, frosted by decades of wave action. He kept it on the windowsill where he could see it while working. The friendship required no shared language because it was built on mutual pattern recognition across species. They learned to read him. He learned to read them. The vocabulary was limited, but the grammar, timing, repetition, variation, response, grew sophisticated enough to carry meaning that surprised him with its nuance. Year 7 brought something new, play. The smaller one, younger or perhaps just more curious, began a game. It would surface with an object, a shell, a piece of coral, a smooth stone, hold it above water briefly, then drop it. The game was for him to point to where he thought it had sunk. If he pointed correctly, the smaller one would retrieve it and bring it back to the surface. If he pointed wrong, the scout would make a sound he started interpreting as amusement. They played this game for hours. It served no purpose he could identify beyond the activity itself. That was how he knew it was play. He invented a game in return, skipping stones across the calm water inside the tidal pool, seeing how many skips he could achieve. They watched with what seemed like fascination, occasionally diving to retrieve stones that sank in interesting patterns. Once the scout tried to replicate the motion, holding a flat stone in its mouth and attempting to throw it with a jerk of its head. The stone barely left the water. The sound it made afterward was unmistakable frustration, then something that might have been laughter. He laughed too, alone on the rocks in the dark, playing games with creatures that shouldn't exist, laughing. That was the year he stopped recording their visits in clinical terms. His log entries became shorter, less formal. They came tonight, stayed late. The small one brought an urchin shell. Or rough seas. They didn't surface, but I heard them calling from deep water. I called back. The rituals had become routine. The routine had become relationship. The relationship had become the central fact of his life on the rocks, more consistent than weather, more reliable than supply ships, more meaningful than any human contact he'd left behind. Year 8, year 9. The friendship deepened in the way long friendships do, not through dramatic events, but through accumulated presence. He learned to distinguish their moods. They learned to anticipate his needs. There was the night he was sick, feverish, and dragged himself to the rocks more from habit than intention. They surfaced immediately, stayed close, made soft vocalizations he'd never heard before. They didn't leave until he did, as if they were monitoring him. There was the evening he was euphoric after completing a complex repair to the lamp mechanism and came to the pool still riding the high of successful problem-solving. They sensed it somehow. Both of them breached, full body leaps he'd only seen a handful of times, and he understood it as shared joy. There was the long twilight when he sat silent, watching the sunset, thinking about nothing in particular, and they floated motionless 20 feet offshore, just being present. No signals, no games, no exchange, just 3 conscious beings sharing space. That was the texture of it. Not constant revelation, but quiet companionship built across years of repeated contact. They were his friends, genuinely. He didn't know what he was to them exactly, but it was something more than curiosity and less than obligation. It was year 10 when his questions started. He'd always wondered, but he'd kept the wondering private. Speculation in his journal, theories he didn't voice. But the trust had grown deep enough that curiosity became insistent. He wanted to know what they were, where they came from, whether there were others, what brought them to these rocks specifically. He started asking through gesture and repetition, the only way he knew how. He would point to them, then spread his hands in question. He would point to the horizon, then back, miming return. He would hold up fingers, 2, then more, asking about numbers. He would draw shapes in sand during low tide, representations of things he'd seen, asking for confirmation or correction. The questions took months to formulate clearly, longer for them to understand what he was asking. And when they finally did understand, something changed. They stopped playing. They still came on schedule, but the ease had left their movements. The scout began surfacing at a distance before approaching, as if checking something first. The smaller one watched him with an intensity that felt like evaluation. He'd asked something that mattered. He didn't know what, but he'd crossed a threshold without realizing it was there. Then came the night in late spring, year 11, when they surfaced together at the far edge of the tidal pool and stayed there, utterly still, in the vertical posture that meant they were listening. Except they weren't listening to something distant. They were listening to each other. The exchange lasted 20 minutes. He heard vocalizations he'd never heard before, complex and layered, modulating in ways that suggested structure. Language, maybe. Debate, possibly. Decision. When they finally moved, they swam directly to the rocks where he sat, closer than they'd ever come, close enough that he could have reached out and touched them, though he didn't. The scout made a sound, low, resonant, sustained. Then it dipped its head in the gesture he'd learned meant acknowledgement. They were going to answer him, not now, but soon. He understood that from the pattern, from the way they held his gaze before diving, from the fact that they didn't return for 3 full tidal cycles afterward. They were deciding whether to show him something, and he realized, sitting alone on the rocks in the days that followed, that he'd been so focused on wanting to know that he'd never asked himself whether he actually wanted the answer. The friendship had been enough, more than enough. It had filled the silence without requiring explanation, but he'd asked, and they had decided to trust him. He spent the next week feeling something he couldn't quite name. Not anticipation, exactly, not dread. Closer to the feeling before a door opens onto a room you've only imagined, and you're suddenly uncertain whether you want to see inside. They returned on the new moon. He'd learned their patterns well enough to expect the visit, but not the intensity of it. Both of them surfaced within minutes of sunset, close to the rocks, and stayed there without movement, waiting. He climbed down to the usual spot. The air was still, the ocean calm in the way it gets between weather systems when everything holds its breath. "I'm here," he said quietly. The scout moved first, swimming a slow circle around the tidal pool's perimeter. The smaller one stayed motionless, vertical in the water, watching him. Then they switched. The scout stopped, the smaller one circled. A pattern he didn't recognize. He sat down on the rock shelf, gave them time. The circling stopped. They faced him from 15 feet offshore, side by side. The scout made a sound, short, sharp, repeated 3 times. A sound he'd learned meant attention, focus, readiness. He nodded. A human gesture they'd learned to read. What happened next took 3 hours. They began by showing him their memory. Not through language, because they didn't share language, not through gesture alone, because some things can't be reduced to movement. They showed him the way apex intelligence shows things to other apex intelligence when neither has words for what needs to be said, through directed experience. The scout dove first, deep enough that he lost sight of it in the dark water. When it surfaced, it was carrying something, bioluminescent, pulsing with rhythmic light. Not an organism he recognized. It held the thing carefully, letting the light patterns play across the water's surface. He watched the patterns. Rhythm and variation. Pulses that clustered, then separated, then clustered again, in different configurations. The light moved like heartbeat, like breath, like something measuring time in units that had nothing to do with seconds. The smaller one vocalized while he watched, long, modulating tones that seemed to match the light's rhythm, sound and light together, creating something that bypassed language and went straight to pattern recognition. He felt his brain trying to parse it, finding structures, detecting repetition with variation. It was beautiful. That was his first response, pure aesthetic appreciation. It was information. That was his second realization, minutes later, as the patterns began to feel less random and more deliberate. The scout released the bioluminescent thing. It sank out of sight. Then both of them dove together, deep and synchronized, and were gone for nearly 5 minutes. When they surfaced, they brought nothing, but they'd changed. He couldn't articulate how he knew something in their movements, their positioning, the way they held themselves in the water. They had decided something while they were down there. The smaller one began to swim a pattern on the surface. Not random, not playful, geometric. A widening spiral that turned back on itself, creating shapes he recognized from tide pools, from shell growth, from the structure of storms seen from above. The scout vocalized in pulses, short, long, rhythm like code, like the lamp patterns he used to signal ships, like heartbeat. And slowly, over the course of an hour, he began to understand that they were asking him a question, not with words, not with any single gesture, but through accumulated pattern, repeated and varied. They were checking whether he could recognize something, whether he saw what they were showing him. He didn't know what he was supposed to see, but he focused on the patterns with everything he had, letting them bypass his conscious interpretation, just watching the way they moved and sounded and fit together, spiral and pulse, light and rhythm, geometry that replicated across scales. They were showing him structure. When he nodded, slowly, uncertainly, not sure if he'd understood, but trying to signal recognition, they stopped moving, both of them instantly still. Then the scout swam closer, closer than it had ever come, close enough that he could see the details of its face in the dim light, the eyes, dark and clear, watching him with unmistakable intelligence. Close enough that when it made the next sound, he felt the vibration in his chest. The sound was complex, layered, multiple frequencies at once, modulating in ways that seemed to carry more information than any single vocalization should hold. And underneath it, or maybe within it, he heard something else, a resonance that didn't come from the creature itself, but from the water around it, as if the ocean was amplifying or adding to the sound. He sat very still. The smaller one dove, returned with another bioluminescent organism, different from the first. This one pulsed faster, erratic, breaking the patterns the first had established. The scout vocalized again, same complex layering, but different frequencies. They were showing him variation now, breaking their own patterns to demonstrate that the patterns were choices, not instinct. He understood suddenly that this was language, not their language to each other, but a language they'd constructed for him, built over months, maybe years, preparing for this moment. They'd been working toward this conversation before he knew to ask his questions. "You planned this," he said aloud. The scout dipped its head. Acknowledgement. The smaller one began another pattern, broader movements now, covering more water, taking longer to complete. The scout joined it, both of them swimming synchronized paths that wove around each other without touching. The patterns they traced on the surface looked like interference waves, like the complicated geometries that emerge when multiple wave sources overlap. And he saw it then, not intellectually, not as hypothesis. He saw it with the same direct perception you have when optical illusion suddenly inverts and reveals its hidden image. They were showing him how they thought, not the content of their thoughts, but the structure, layered, parallel, distributive. Consciousness that wasn't centralized the way his was, wasn't linear, didn't process sequentially. They thought the way waves interfered, the way tides pulled from multiple sources, the way schools of fish moved as collective decision without central command. They were trying to prepare him for something they knew he couldn't think in his architecture, so they were showing him their architecture first, giving him a map to territory his cognition couldn't naturally traverse. He felt his hands shaking, not from fear, from the sheer cognitive effort of trying to hold patterns his brain hadn't evolved to process. They must have sensed it. They stopped moving, floated quietly, giving him time. "I don't know if I can understand," he said. His voice sounded strange to him, thin against the size of what was happening. The scout made a soft sound. Then it did something it had never done before. It rolled partially onto its back, exposing its ventral surface. Vulnerability as communication. Trust. The smaller one swam a single, simple circle. The first pattern they'd taught him years ago, the one that meant invitation. They were asking if he wanted to continue, if he wanted to see what came next, and they were making clear that the choice was his, that he could stop now, and they would ask nothing more of him. He thought about the friendship they'd built, the years of careful trust, the games and gifts and quiet companionship. He thought about his life on the rocks, the solitude that had become sustainable only because they'd filled it with meaning. He thought about what it meant that they were offering to show him something, to bring him closer to whatever they actually were, that they trusted him enough to try. "Show me," he said. The scout righted itself in the water, made the sharp three-pulse sound again, readiness. Then both of them dove deep, and he waited. They were gone longer this time, 10 minutes, then 15. long enough that he started to worry, started imagining that something had changed their minds or called them away. But they returned. When they surfaced, they came up fast, breaching halfway out of the water in a way he'd only seen during their most euphoric moments. Except this wasn't euphoria. This was urgency. The scout vocalized, rapid, insistent. The smaller one swam to the base of the rocks, closer than close, near enough that he could see water streaming from its skin, could see the intricate patterns of scarring and pigmentation that made each of them individual. It looked directly at him, held his gaze, and made a sound that he felt more than heard, subsonic, resonating in his chest and bones and the rock beneath him. The world shifted. Not literally. He didn't lose consciousness, didn't hallucinate, didn't experience anything supernatural, but something in his perception inverted, the way vision inverts when you've been staring at an after image and suddenly see negative space as positive. He was aware of the ocean, not as view or environment, but as presence. Massive, connected, ancient, beyond his ability to measure. Not conscious the way he was conscious, but not unconscious either. Organized, operational, doing something. The mermaids weren't showing him through explanation. They were directing his attention, the way you direct someone's gaze to a constellation by pointing, and suddenly they see the pattern they'd been looking at without seeing. He saw the ocean as system, not ecosystem. He'd understood that concept for decades. System as in mechanism, infrastructure, process running at planetary scale with purpose built into its structure. The mermaids hung motionless in the water, and he understood they were part of it. Not inhabitants, not even guardians. Components. Conscious components, maybe, but integrated into something so much larger than consciousness that awareness seemed almost incidental to function. He opened his mouth. No. Words came. The scout dove again. When it surfaced, it had nothing, but its body was lit with bioluminescence, not from carried organisms, but from its own skin, patterns lighting and dimming in sequences he couldn't follow. The smaller one matched it, both of them pulsing with light in the dark water, and he realized he was seeing communication at bandwidth human language couldn't approach. They were talking to each other, or to something else, or maybe just demonstrating capacity. The light show lasted 3 minutes, then darkness again, and silence except for the sound of water moving against rock. "What are you part of?" he asked. His voice was steady. He was surprised by that. They couldn't answer in words. But they'd been answering for the past 3 hours through every other means available, and he'd understood enough to know that the next answer, the real answer, was going to be the one he couldn't unhear. The scout swam very close. It made a sound like the first sound, the layered one that vibrated in his chest, but longer this time, more complex. And then they showed him the purpose. They took him down on the autumn equinox of his 14th year at the Lighthouse, not physically. He remained in the lantern room, his hands on the iron railing, his boots on solid glass. But they showed him anyway, through a method he spent the rest of his life unable to adequately describe, though he tried in the margins of his logbooks where no inspector would read. It began with the water itself. He'd always seen the Atlantic as alive, moving, breathing, temperamental. Now he understood it was not metaphorically alive, it was functionally a single organism. The currents weren't circulation, they were thought. The thermohaline loops carrying warm water north and cold water south over 1,000-year cycles, those were memory formation. The chemical exchanges at every surface, every reef, every hydrothermal vent, signal processing. The mermaids didn't explain this with language. They showed him pattern. Every whale migration he'd ever witnessed, not following food, but distributing nutrients with precision across systems that required specific timing. Every plankton bloom, not random, but triggered, coordinated, necessary for atmospheric regulation. Every fish, every coral, every scuttling crab moving in rhythms that interlocked across scales from bacterial to continental. Not ecosystem, infrastructure. He saw his lighthouse from their perspective, a minor surface feature maintained by a component so brief-lived the ocean's attention didn't register individual humans, only the aggregate pattern of coastal maintenance their species provided. Useful the way kelp holdfasts are useful, functional, unremarkable, not requiring relationship. The purpose they showed him operated on timescales where human civilization was a flicker. The ocean had been regulating planetary chemistry for 3 billion years. It would continue. It was in communication. His mind supplied the inadequate word with other water systems across distances he couldn't fathom, through mechanisms chemistry couldn't yet detect. They meant it as gift, as trust. They didn't understand, he realized later, that humans need to be needed, that love requires the possibility of reciprocation. That meaning dies when you discover your devotion was never noticed. When he surfaced back into his own perception, dawn was coming. The mermaids waited in the water below, their faces turned upward, expectant. He tried to signal gratitude. His hands shook too badly to complete the gesture. He didn't sleep for 3 days afterward. Not from fear, there was nothing to fear. The ocean wasn't hostile. It simply had purpose that predated his species and would outlast it by epochs. He was, in the most literal sense, inconsequential to its function. On the 4th day he returned to his routines because routines were what remained when meaning evacuated. He trimmed the lamp wick at dawn. The lighthouse beam that had felt like service now revealed itself as minor debris management, keeping one species' navigation devices functional the way barnacles filter feed without the rock caring. He watched the tide pools at noon, seeing for the first time the actual pattern underneath the apparent chaos. Every anemone, every urchin, positioned not by chance but by function, he now recognized. Nutrient distribution, waste processing, gas exchange. Each creature, a cell in an organ he'd mistaken for community. The mermaids returned on schedule that evening. He couldn't approach the rocks. He stood at the gallery rail watching them surface, their heads turning to locate him, and felt grief so profound it had no temperature. They'd given him their world's truth. He couldn't explain that the gift had cost him his own. They waited 20 minutes. He saw confusion in their stillness. This was their reality. They'd been born knowing it. They'd shared what seemed like fundamental fact. Why would fact create distance? When they finally dove, the water closed over them with the mechanical precision of a system returning to equilibrium. He began measuring time differently after that. Not days or months, but cycles, spring upwelling, autumn turnover, the 17-day interval between certain bioluminescent blooms. He was seeing the ocean's actual clock now, the rhythms that mattered to maintenance and regulation, human time, his shifts, his supply deliveries, his aging, ran parallel to these cycles without ever intersecting them. The loneliness wasn't new. He'd been alone on the rock for 14 years. But he'd had companionship. He'd had the sea itself as presence. Now he had accurate perception, and accurate perception had revealed that presence was projection. The waves had always been mechanism. He'd just been too small to see the machinery. He tried to tell them he didn't want it anymore. This was 3 weeks after the revelation, when he could stand at the rocks again without his vision tunneling. He brought no offering. He came at the wrong tide. He stood where they surfaced and waited, and when the first one appeared, he'd learned to distinguish them by the scarring patterns on their shoulders. He didn't greet her. He pointed at his own head, then at the water, then made the gesture they'd developed for before, a specific motion that meant the time when things were different. She watched him. The second mermaid surfaced beside her. He repeated it, pointed to himself, to them, made the sign for take away, for undo. They didn't move. He tried for an hour, different combinations of the gestures they'd built together over years. He knelt on the rocks and pressed his palms together in a pleading shape, He wasn't sure they'd understand, but that his body needed to make anyway. The first mermaid tilted her head, made a soft sound, not language, but something he recognized as confusion. He realized then they didn't understand what he was asking because they'd never known anything else. This was their reality. They were born into the mechanism. They'd never experienced the ocean as wonder. They couldn't make him forget because they didn't know what forgetting would mean. He stopped coming to the rocks after that. The lighthouse still needed tending. He maintained the lamp with the same precision he always had, cleaned the lens on schedule, logged the weather, wound the clockwork. Duty persisted beyond meaning. This was something he learned in his final years, that the body continues its routines even after the purpose underneath them has dissolved. He was 68 when he retired, 22 years at the lighthouse, the last 11 carrying knowledge that had made the ocean alien. In his final log entry, he recorded wind speed, visibility, and sea state with perfect accuracy. He signed his name. He noted the date of his replacement's arrival. He didn't write anything else. The new keeper found him sitting on the gallery at dawn, watching the water. He'd already packed his belongings. He answered questions about the equipment with patient thoroughness. He explained the maintenance schedules, the quirks of the lamp mechanism, the patterns of the local weather. He didn't mention the rocks below. He didn't mention what came to visit. He moved to a town 17 miles inland. No ocean view. He took a small room above a shop and lived on his pension. People who knew him there, the few who did, described him as quiet, polite, and profoundly alone in a way that had nothing to do with whether people were present. He died at 73. Heart failure, winter morning, no drama. In his room they found no journals, no photographs, no record of where he'd been or what he'd done. He'd kept nothing from the lighthouse years except his logbooks, and those contained only weather data and maintenance notes, precise, thorough, and completely empty of anything that mattered. The pattern appears in keeper records across decades. Men who retired to harbors but never took boats out again, who lived beside the water but stopped watching it. The files don't explain why. They just note the withdrawal. Folklore has always understood what records don't say. In Scottish tradition, those who hear the sea's true voice can never hear music the same way. Japanese legends warn that Ningyo grant knowledge that outlives joy. The details change. The warning stays consistent. We don't know if our keeper's story happened exactly this way. But something drove men from the stations they'd loved. Something made witnesses leave certain truths unwritten. The haunting part isn't the revelation itself. It's the quiet afterward. A man still doing his job, still competent, still sane, just unable to feel what he felt before. Maybe that's the real cost of certain knowledge, not madness, but the end of wonder.